Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game So today I got a very fun, very exciting, and a little bit tongue-in-cheek episode for you guys today because we're going to be doing one more tour through the 3DO M2 hardware. Because a few weeks ago on Twitter I mentioned this in regards to potentially selling one of my backup units, and I got so many inbox messages on Twitter and to my email basically saying that I was making this all up, that the 3DO M2 hardware never released, did not exist, and one person even went so far as to say I was using generative AI to create these images right now. It is absolutely insane, made me laugh, and I figured why not make one more video about my favorite unreleased game hardware out there. And in all honesty, I had to do a camera test, both for a new lens as well as some compression on YouTube. I've been seeing a little bit of macro blocking in some of the images if there's a little bit too much contrast, so it's half a test, half a fun video for you guys. But honestly, back in the day, I was a huge 3DO fan, and I still am today, so when I had heard in magazines that M2 was coming and Panasonic had bought the exclusive rights to the console, basically seemed like a slam dunk thing that we were going to be playing by like summer of 1996. Unfortunately, Panasonic took the hardware out back behind the woodshed and old yellered the ever-loving hell out of the thing, killing it basically before it even had a chance to live. But the reality is, it did live a life outside of a gaming use, even if the arcade boards do exist. This is the Panasonic FC21S1T. This was sold, as far as I can tell and verify, for two distinct uses. One as a kiosk to train elderly people on how to drive and make sure they can still drive, and another to have a memory matching brain game to keep people from getting dementia. So this console right here, the one that was developed to play video games by the 3DO company, ended up being nothing more than just usage for the elderly. And I'm not saying that the elderly don't deserve fun things, I'm just saying for as much work and as much time and money went into this project, its actual use case is absolutely insane. But it's a hell of a good looking console, and I've got more than one sitting around here hanging out, and that is why I've collected all these things, so I can document them, so I can show them to everybody, and I've spent an inordinate amount of money finding software so I can dump it and share it out there for free. Now trust me, I totally get that not everyone has a 3DO M2, so not everyone can play those dumps, but honestly, maybe one day there could be an FPGA core for the M2. I have hardware waiting to be donated to anyone who can actually get it done and I trust, so you can play it. But you'll see right here, this is the disc for CG4000 and not CG computer graphics, because I didn't make this up. It is a real disc. This is what they would put in with an entire control panel for a wheel and pedal set to make sure the elderly drivers still had the reaction times to basically be able to stop before they got into an accident. I cannot make this stuff up. That is what it was used for. And even though the hardware does exist, we know there's at least 3,500 of them produced based upon serial numbers that we have seen, the highest one being in like the 35XX range. They are exceedingly rare to find. Now I wish this thing played something like Tobey Polystars or any of the arcade games, but at this point in time that has not been completely figured out yet. But because the FC21 only has 8 megabytes of RAM versus the arcade 16 minus Tobey Polystars, which also shipped on 8 megabytes of RAM, if any arcade game was to ever work, it would only be Tobey Polystars, because I'm pretty sure even modifiers and coders out there, if they could get it running on the FC21, wouldn't be able to make it use basically 50% of the RAM that it could be allocated for, but it would still be a ton of fun. But the reality is, you maybe played a 3DO M2 back in the day in arcades in North America, or if you're in Japan, maybe there as well, because Evil Knight and Total Vice both came to North America, United States, Canada, as well as Mexico, and Heat of 11 Soccer even ended up in South America, because I do have a board that came from there. So you could have played one of these and just didn't realize it. Now around the back, you're going to see that you have all of the different diverse ports back here. Communication, you have composite, stereo, S-video, as well as the expansion port. This takes in a PCMCIA card. It would have been used for modems, and on a prototype unit it's also used to load the BIOS in, because these didn't actually ship with any BIOS on them. Now this is a production unit, so it does have the BIOS in there, but the engineering samples were completely BIOS free. You had to put your own in. But now let's take a look at the Panasonic FC35, the much less romantic shaped 3DO M2, but the much more capable one, and the one that I would recommend you buy unless you are a collector who really wants to have an FC21. This is the FC35 interactive media player, and this is also sold for different usages, mostly in car dealerships. They would put different DVDs in here. It comes shipping with a hard drive, so you could basically interact with different car models and see videos before you took a test drive. That was the #1 use of something like this out there. It was also sold exclusively exclusively in Japan for VizHouse, which is basically a 3D CAD program where you could design and build your own house and put your furniture in. That was part of Panasonic's line of what they use this hardware for. So if we take a look around the back, you're going to see this is the FC351H1-M, and those characters will change whether or not this is for VizHouse or for car dealership usage, because VizHouse also shipped with a super disk that you could basically save onto outside of the hard drive as well. But this unit here is what will play every single bit of 3DO M2 software that is not for the arcades, and hopefully one day in the future it'll also play the arcade games, because this has the full 16 megabytes of RAM on it that the arcade spec did. So anything that will run on a 3DO M2 that is not an actual arcade game is going to run here. The nice part is the BIOS is decrypted. It doesn't have any encryption on it whatsoever, so software does not need to be signed. And even though I do have from old SDKs and old employees of the 3DO company that worked on this, the signing keys for the FC21, honestly, this is the target hardware for basically everything. And compared to the FC21, which is around a $25,000 to $30,000 console these days, a good FC35 in working condition tops out around like maybe $6,000. And I'm not saying that's cheap in any way, shape, or form. It's at least a couple rent payments or mortgage payments for most people, but it is in the realm of attainability, and it actually does play games. It's one of those things. The FC21 looks like a console, and that's what everyone wants to have under their TVs or in their collections, but the FC35 really is the unit that plays the software. And you will see here it does use a DVD-ROM drive. That is because the M2 spec was always expandable, and 3DO and Panasonic had planned maybe in 98 or 99 before the new console released in 2000-2001, because there was a successor, to ship this thing with a DVD drive so you could watch movies before PlayStation 2 ever hit the market. This is also the unit that's going to play stuff like Iron Blood here. This is a Dungeons & Dragons fighting game that was originally designed for the 3DO M2. Before that hardware was canceled, it moved over to PlayStation 1. But you can see real-time lighting here. You can pause the camera, you can zoom in, and you can see just how many polygons these models are actually made out of. But this right here would be anything PlayStation 1, Sega Saturn, Nintendo 64 could do in 1996 until Panasonic slow-rolled the console into 1997 before they finally canceled it. So sadly, all this engineering work, all this game design and coding work never actually saw release on the 3DO M2 outside of Konami becoming a licensee for the arcade boards, which we will get to in a moment. But just take a look at how nice this model looks right here. This is an unfinished, basically alpha build, and it's still going to run around the mid 20 frames per second, like 20 to 30 frames per second. I did talk to some of the people that were working on this, and they were fully confident that with more polish, this could be a 60 frame per second locked game. And that is because the 3DO M2 had a lot of horsepower, and honestly, it never really got tapped to its full potential. But if we take a look around at the back of the FC35, it does have RGB support. Serial connectors are things like touchscreens as well as printers, S-Video, controller, port, composite, and you can even put a keyboard and mouse into it. It even has that DB25 port at the bottom there, so you can plug in different accessories. But the FC35 was Panasonic's way of trying to make money back from the 3DO M2 purchase from the 3DO company, $100 million that never ended up being a console. And there's also the FC55. I've never been able to find one, but it was the most common unit after all, because it was in ATMs and coffee makers. The ATMs are mostly in Russia and Eastern Europe. The coffee makers and other vending machines were in Japan, but if you think about how many different ATMs and vending machines are out there could have been 50,000 or 100,000 3DO M2 units just sitting there letting you get cash or a hot cup of coffee. But the FC35 was primarily used for different GM software so they could showcase cars in the dealership, and I do have a lot of that, and I have dumped a metric ton of it for people. Now taking a look at the arcade board, technically this is called the Tarantula. Konami loved to give their boards either bug names or actual snake names. This is where the real games lie, and the nice part is if you actually want a 3DO M2 for your own collection, this is also where the games aren't that expensive. Top end, if I was going to sell one of my copies of Tobey Polystars, I'd look for $1,500 to $2,000. Every game under that probably going to be obviously less. But honestly, I absolutely love the arcade hardware. It's got all the games I need from Konami on there for M2, and it gives you 5 titles to play. And it sounds like this soundtrack sample, and I'll be right back with more M2 history. Awesome soundtrack, awesome sound effects, and Evil Knight is a ton of fun, but the good thing is these games will emulate in MAME. The emulation is not perfect, it will not be full speed at this point in time, but you can experience them, and my favorite part is when I hear comments that the 3DO M2 never existed and there's no games to play on it. You'll have to explain that to Konami and MAME because there's 5 games that run on the hardware, and they all seem to be games that I'm able to play. If we take a look at the hardware in and of itself here, the M2 is comprised of the 2 PowerPC 602s, the CE32 chip, as well as Bulldog. And interestingly, it's not complete, but there is an incomplete ARM core inside of the silicon on the 3DO side of things that could have made it backwards compatible with original 3DO hardware that never actually got finished up, but it is still in the silicon in the documentation in brief, basically just saying that it was something that they were looking at to basically put a whole 3DO inside one of these chips. And if you're wondering what this is the Bulldog ASIC. I showed it a few years ago in a video. I actually was able to find this from somebody on Discord who found a computer recycler in China that had about 10 of these new old stock chips in. That's probably because with the ATMs and with the coffee makers and vending machines, this chip probably actually got some big runs out there because, again, Panasonic had to try to make that $100 million investment back somehow. Now if we take a look at the PowerPC 602 on the arcade board inside the FC21 and FC35, this is a cut down version of the 603. It was a budget part and it was used in all of 2 places, in the 3DO M2 design as well as in satellites in space for satellite telephone communication. And that's just because, a little factoid, PowerPC is better at not flipping bits for background radiation compared to other processors. But this is also where all of the code is running on if you're playing a 3DO M2 arcade game, or if you have hardware and you're playing any of the dumps out there that I've supplied. Mine is IMSA or IMSA Racing. That was done by somebody different. But I've spent a lot of time hunting this all down just because I was curious. I'm not the type of person or personality that likes to be told no when it comes to I want something and then somebody takes it away from me like Panasonic. So I figured, once I heard rumors that M2 hardware actually existed out in the wild, I figured I would try to see if I could find a little bit of it. That was about 15 years ago, and I basically found every single piece of software minus one, including a prototype 3DO M2 development controller, and this was actually given to me by an ex-developer that worked at 3DO on the hardware. Not saying names because they asked not to be named, but I've had this thing maybe for like the last 7-8 years now, and this is what you'd basically get in a development kit. This is serial number 517, but I really presume it might be the 5th revision and the 17th controller they produced, because I don't think they made 517 of them out there. But this thing does work. You can plug it into a 3DO or a 3DO M2 and it will actually control everything. But I will say, definitely a very engineering sample here, because this thing is basically held together with zip ties, duct tape, and dreams, and that's about as far as it's going to go. And if you wonder what that is in the middle, basically they put a piece of electrical tape over buttons they weren't using, because this is just a third-party shell from 3DO with a custom PCB on the inside. I didn't tear it down for this shoot, but I have in the past, so go ahead and look at my 3DO M2 playlist and you'll be able to find it there. But the nice thing is you can use this on the FC21. You just pop it in the controller port and you're good to go. But this is also backwards compatible with the original 3DO controller, so you can use one of those as well. Although granted, I think the only person watching this that actually has one is going to be me. And you can also use it in the back of the FC35 as well as original controllers. The only thing you can't use it on at this point in time is the arcade boards, but people have looked at this, I've looked at this, and the pinout to actually put a controller port on the arcade boards does exist. You can tap the signals and basically solder your own port in. So maybe one day, if you can find an arcade board, we'll have a way that you can actually load up some of the console software we have for it. But this was basically, like I said, just a fun little response to being told online that the 3DO M2 does not exist, has never existed, does not have any games released for, and that these images may in fact be AI. Apparently Gemini is getting really good these days and I'll be out of work soon. But all jokes aside, I figured it'd be fun to talk about this one more time because I did need to do a camera test. I figured as opposed to just shooting resolution charts and different color charts, I'd make a whole video about the 3DO M2 one more time just because I have a bigger audience now and maybe some of you didn't know this existed. Leave me a comment down below. Tell me if you had an M2 on pre-order back in the day like I did, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.